Hi guys, so this week and next we're talking about interrogations and confessions. This week is a little bit more about interrogations. So I'm going to explain what's called the Reid technique. It's the most common interrogation technique in police departments. And it was developed by someone named Reid and his associates, and they run a consulting business that offers training to police departments. And it's popular because it gets confessions. So here are the steps of the Reid technique. So the first is direct positive confrontation. And all this really means is that you say that you know that they're guilty, you say what you think they did, and you tell them that you have evidence, real or fictional. So it's important to note here, obviously, that police are allowed to lie to you, and they're allowed to say that they have evidence that they do not have. Step two is what they call theme development. We're going to watch a little bit of the Reid technique training video that goes into detail about this, but basically it's a moment when you, as the interrogator, try to empathize with the suspect and propose reasons that will justify or excuse the commission of the crime. So you're empathizing with them, you're showing them that actually it wouldn't be that bad of a thing if they confessed to doing this. And step three and step four and step five are all sort of part of the same thing, and it starts at the beginning and goes throughout. So the idea is stopping denials. That's step three. You want to stop the person from saying that they are not guilty, because saying that you are not guilty will reinforce that in your mind. And this is all straight from the Reid technique training. That is what they say, that if you let them say that they are not guilty, that will get ingrained in their mind. And you want to overcome any objections they have, any sort of alibis, and you want to get their attention. And this mostly involves physical movements like physical closeness, physical gestures of sincerity, peak of sincerity in your speech. And step six, if you're doing this right, the suspect quiets and listens. And as they put it, physical signs of surrender begin to appear. Tears at this stage positively indicate the suspect's guilt. So this is part of the Reid philosophy. Step seven, so once tears have appeared, the idea is that you offer alternatives. And the idea is that the two alternatives, either choice is an admission of guilt. So you give them a choice between an acceptable reason and an unacceptable reason for committing the crime. And one alternative is stressed to lead the subject to choose the positive alternative. But in either case, the person is admitting guilt. And so in step eight, you get them to accept that alternative, that more positive alternative. And then you get the themes of an oral confession. That confession in step nine, you as the interrogator write down the confession, and you have the suspect sign it. So to sort of translate this, the first two are a way of establishing the situation. You have the positive confrontation and the theme development. Steps 3 through 6 are all about shutting down the suspect, as Reid himself put it, to get them to shut up. The explicit idea here is to create a sense of hopelessness, that nothing you could say could get you out of it, because you're not allowed to speak. Step 7 is significant, I think, because you give the false impression of options, neither of which is innocent, obviously. Something like accident versus intentional. And giving false evidence here obviously would help a lot to get this to get the suspect involved. And then in this step 7, you, the interrogator, are providing the confession. You're giving them the words for the confession. It was an accident. I didn't mean to. I was just really stressed out, or whatever option you're giving them. And you ask the suspect to repeat it back to you in step 8, which is the oral confession. And then in 9, you write it down and you get them to sign it. So I'm going to show you a video that they use in training, prepare yourself for some truly 90s graphics and hairstyles. You might notice a couple things in that video. The first one is who's doing the talking. It's the interrogator, right? Not the suspect. The suspect hardly said anything. Um, and that's because steps 3 through 6 are all about making the person stop talking. And step 8, the confession, is actually the first time you, quote, bring the suspect into the conversation. And all of this means, of course, that the interrogator is not looking for information. There'd be questions if they were looking for information. What they're looking for is a confession. And they say right from the beginning, you might have noticed, the first thing that they say is, these are the steps that will lead you to getting a confession. And this technique is very good at getting one. So in more recent years, there have been studies done specifically on why this technique is so effective. And they've also incidentally found that while it's very good at producing confessions, it's not very good at distinguishing between true and false confessions. So one study done by a researcher named Casson was with a computer. And the way that it would work is 2 students would sit at a table with a computer, and one of them was part of the experiment, and the other one was the subject of the experiment. And the experimenter would read letters from a chart for the other to type. So one of them is typing, the subject is typing. The experimenter would warn the student not to hit the Alt key, and that hitting it would cause the computer to crash. And of course, the computer was programmed to crash automatically 60 seconds after the experiment began. And so at that point, the experimenter would ask angrily if the participants had hit the Alt key. And they would rip a page out of their notebook and write an admission of guilt and demand that the student sign it. And this was actually just sort of a baseline to try to give a baseline confession rate to see how many people would just sign it. And then they added on top of that, so that was the control, they added on top of that various read tactics to see how effective they were. So the first time he tried the experiment with 75 participants, the students were so intimidated just by the accusatory act, like the accusatory question, that about a quarter of them signed the confession. So there's our baseline for false confessions. When the experimenter added false incrimination, so saying something like, I saw you hit it, or offering that they had a fake printout, that they didn't show them, but they had a printout of the keystrokes, and so they knew that they had hit it. The rate of false confession nearly doubled. So we're at 50% now for a false confession rate. And when asked afterwards what happened, students who confessed usually put the blame on themselves, saying things like, I hit the wrong button, rather than they accused me of hitting the wrong button. Some even made up details, some fabricated details to go along with this false confession, like I hit it with the side of my hand. And not only had they internalized their guilt, so they had come up with a story to explain it. And the researcher at the end made sure to inform the students that this was a hoax. It was automatically going to crash. And some students replied, "You're just trying to make me feel better." To add another study from just a few years ago, a psychology PhD candidate conducted a study that took direct aim at the idea that ordinary innocent people would never confess to a serious crime they didn't commit. So one of the criticisms of this computer study was that hitting the Alt key and making a computer crash is not the same as confessing to a crime. And so she wanted to look at this issue, and in just 3 one-hour sessions, so you'll see in Scenes of a Crime, his interrogation, Adrian Thomas's interrogation, is 16 hours. So in 3 separate 1-hour sessions, which is not a long interrogation at all in the scope of things, she was able to convince 21 of her 30 college-age subjects, so your age, that they'd committed a crime when they were about 12 years old, that they had assaulted another child with a weapon, and that they had had a run-in with the police as a result. And so she had asked them in a survey things like, where did you grow up? Details about sort of their childhood. And so then she supplied those back. She supplied details that were recognizable, the location where the assault had supposedly happened. And I talked to her about this, and she said she had designed her study to mimic the Reid technique. So she would use the Reid technique on these students. And the results were so alarming that she stopped administering the experiment before she had run through her full sample, because she was afraid of traumatizing her subjects. So just to reiterate, at the end of this, she convinced 21 out of 30 people, normal people, your age, students at UBC actually, University of British Columbia, that they had committed serious assault on another child when they were 12 years old and that the police had gotten involved. So here's an example of how it might work, of some details I might give you. So if I were going to try to get a confession out of you that you plagiarized your paper. And usually at this point, when I say this in front of the class, people start squirming in their seats. So I'm imagining that. So I start by saying, obviously for the direct confrontation, I start by saying, I have software that shows that you plagiarized, that we have evidence. And maybe I wave a printout in front of you. But then I tell you, look, this happens all the time. It's very easy to do. You could easily have just been copying notes from a source, and you've got a lot of documents open, and you of course deny it because it's not true. But I immediately try to shut down those denials and don't let you speak and say, look, I know you're a good student, you're a hard worker, freshman year is super stressful, and you're not the type of person to do this. This isn't like you. Things must be really hard right now. You're staying up late with work. This isn't reflective of the kind of student that you are. You might still deny it, but if I'm doing a good job with this, I'll just interrupt any denials saying, let me finish. So I'll go on about what a good student you are, how this isn't like you, this isn't something that you would normally do. And then in step 7, I would offer, the only question is, did you have a bunch of documents open? You were pressed for time and you didn't sleep well, and these things happened. You just accidentally copied some sentences from one document to another. No one could blame you for that. Are you saying there's no chance something like that happened? No one could be totally sure that that didn't happen. Because the other option is that you purposefully sought out someone else's work, copied and pasted it, and now you're lying to me. And that's very serious. That's grounds for expulsion. So was it on accident or was it on purpose? And so now we've entered step 8. And obviously I would try to drag this out because the idea is apparently before step 7, you're supposed to get the person to cry. So I would try to make you cry before I went to step 7. So for your participation below, this is something I like to do in class because it's participatory and it's kind of fun / horrifying. I want you to imagine an interrogation for something like plagiarism or lying on your application to Duke, falsifying your application to Duke, or selling prescription drugs to fellow students. So 3 options. Most of these steps in the Reid technique remain the same, like shutting down denials. But what would step 2, theme development, and step 7, where you're offering the 2 options, look like? So the step 2 is where you sort of lower the bar to confessing. You say that it's not that big a deal. This is not the type of person they are. And then step 7 is where you offer 2 options, both of which are guilt. So how would you design that interrogation? And then additionally, why do you think this is so effective? Another option is that you can talk about, if this is if this is what interrogation is, then what is the purpose of interrogation? What is the definition of interrogation? What's it for? What is it not for? So this week you'll be watching the Scenes of a Crime, which is about Adrian Thomas. And just to sort of set the stage a little bit, he's unemployed and depressed. He has 6 children, the youngest of whom are twins who are 4 months old. And Matthew, one of the twins, seemed to have a cold when he went to bed. And when they woke up in the morning, he wasn't breathing well. So they called 911 and an ambulance took him to the hospital. The police came and arrested Adrian and removed all of the children. And so when they go into the interrogation, there doesn't seem to have been any reason why they suspected him of it. There doesn't seem to have been any evidence except that the police had a hunch. And they say they go into the interrogation knowing that he did it, and pursue the Reid technique. So in the documentary, you can sort of watch that happen. And I'll have some questions relating to the documentary in the forums, as well as some questions relating to his specific case, which some of you are doing case briefs on. So have a good week. I will hopefully see some of you Wednesday or Friday. Just a reminder, Wednesday office hours 1:30 and 8 p.m. And then Friday, the live discussion at 1:30 p.m. Have a good week.